Today on the podcast, we have a fascinating conversation that we're going to have. We're going to cover a lot of ground, but if you've ever been curious or interested in these ideas of pure and impure, clean and unclean, the book of Leviticus and what's going on, we have a wonderful guest with us who's done some really deep research that will connect to the book of Leviticus, but also a number of areas in the ancient Near East as a whole. We have with us Dr. Yitzhaq Feder. We're very excited to have on. He is a lecturer in Hebrew Bible at the University of Haifa. He received his PhD from the University of Bar-Ilan, also in Israel, and has been teaching and researching since 2008. And he also won a very coveted award in 2012, the David Noel Freedman Award for Excellence and Creativity in Hebrew Bible Scholarship. Yitzhaq, thank you so much for joining me and Nathan on the podcast. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks.
So we're glad that we are going to get to have this conversation with you. And we're specifically talking about one of your most recent publications, a book that you wrote, which is, I love this title, by the way. I'm not very good at coming up with titles. And so when I read this, I'm like, this is good. This is excellent. We have Purity and Pollution in the Hebrew Bible, from embodied experience to moral metaphor. And this is a very involved book. I mean, you have so many footnotes. You incorporate research from a lot of different areas. Like you do not just biblical, like Hebrew Bible studies. You incorporate ancient Near East history and culture and linguistics, but you even go beyond that. I think most people would, in academic realm, would say those are enough fields. I'll stop there. People will love it. You're like, no, I need to research more. And you get into sociology and psychology. There's a lot we weave into this. So it's going to be infinitely fascinating for people. But I think for this conversation, it'll be really helpful if maybe you just start with just a little bit of an overview about this book, kind of in a nutshell, before we dive into some of the deep points throughout it. Can you go ahead and start by just giving us a little general overview?
Well, I'll go even like more broad than just talking about purity and impurity. I mean, basically what we're dealing with is basically like a lot of maybe what are strange behaviors that we find, in traditional cultures. The idea of impurity is, kind of foreign. But the thing is that it exists, in cultures all over the world. And and all kinds of behaviors associated with impurity. For example, say, banishing women in the times of their menstruation, you find in, cultures all over the world. And all kinds of similar types of behaviors. And the question is, where does this come from? And what happens is, in certain more conventional lines of biblical research, people just kind of pick up the Bible and try to interpret it basically within a more closed framework. And for me, if you're going to try to understand a phenomenon that's basically universal almost, you need to have your scope of research kind of encompass that. So basically, the Bible is in the focus of the study, but basically I'm bringing in, first of all, the closest context, which is the ancient Near East. But it's like circles, concentric circles going into all kinds of other cultures that have purity practices and beliefs. And the truth is, and even the terminology, we just find these parallels, crossing borders. And the question is, where does this all come from? So basically this, it's called, Purity and Pollution in the Hebrew Bible, but it's an attempt to give an account of what is purity and pollution, where does it come from? And the Hebrew Bible is the focus, but it's, I kind of work from the details to the, the general, and then back from the general back to the details. So, the particular. So, so I work with different aspects of it, the what you might call the ontological aspects of what is purity, what is impurity in ancient Israel, but also how the discourse of impurity gets kind of extended to other domains, and particularly, the moral domain. That's where the idea of the moral metaphor comes in. Basically, how this, exists, even in, relatively secular discourses, we still have things about purity and impurity and things like, in fact, purity like lines up everything in the supermarket, and we're constantly extending this terminology into all kinds of different fields. And one of the problems that I also have to address in the book is, how do we focus on what is purity and impurity in ancient Israel and not get carried away with how we think, how we use these terms.
Yeah.
So I'm already getting carried away. So you might want to rope me into something.
Oh, this is great. In fact, something you said.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something you already commented on, segue to one of the most interesting lines that kind of hooked me as I was reading through your book, that really addresses first a foundational problem in how we approach our understanding of, quote, ritual purity. And both in the academic world, as well as, again, our listeners who aren't in the academic space, but we hear about the idea of purity and we're trying to understand concepts in the Hebrew Bible. And one thing you write about is that scholars continue to write about ritual purity as if the cultures of the ancient world shared modern Western attitudes regarding the strict separation of science and religion. And I think it's almost second nature for us to do in our current cultural context. It's just, just like separation of church and state, separation of science and faith, like why would they overlap? And anyway, you really challenge this for how we're approaching the ancient Near East. I wonder if you can kind of unpack this philosophical framework a bit.
Yeah, there's a lot that, could be said. I mean, it's actually interesting, just before I actually address the question directly, just, it's interesting why, at least in certain ways, people want to separate religion from science, because in some ways, in our modern culture, basically, religion is kind of things have changed. Once science was judged, or was judged by religion. If it doesn't fit, we don't need that science, because religion was stronger. People, the faith was sociologically, they had the authority. In modern culture, basically science has the authority. So, if religion is proved to be unscientific, that's dangerous for religion. So in a way, the separation of religion and science, I mean, it's politically correct. I guess it's good for everybody in a certain sense. It's diplomatic. You say, well, we're not going to step on each other's toes. But
until we do. Yeah.
We do anyways. We can't help it. We live together, right? So the thing is this, like, basically, yeah, people writing about impurity, they constantly would use terms like ritual impurity or religious impurity, and kind of like it's part of a different, domain. And the thing is, if the implication would be that people really, it's only related to, say, for example, and you could get this, you could get this kind of feeling when you read the Bible too, actually. It's not completely inaccurate that these things only had a bearing on, like, the holy domain, and that in day-to-day life, there's no real need to be pure or whatever. But if you look at it a little more closely, basically, I mean, you just can't understand, in my mind, you couldn't understand the very drastic implications of some of these practices, like banishing people from the community, if you think it's only pertaining to the holy written domain, and it's not part of day-to-day life. And when you start actually if you come to that realization that basically impurity, and this is what I came to, is that impurity was really a way of discussing, among other things, not only, but among one important thing that impurity was a way of discussing infectious disease, which they didn't have another way of talking about. And in fact, it's, when you look at it in those, if you look at infection as impurity, in fact, is quite a fitting way of talking about, and then suddenly you realize that basically impurity is real. It's not this imaginary thing, which is kind of how it comes out, when you read a lot of this, scholarship, and you can understand why. But once you realize that this is how they actually talked about diseases, and it was very real, and it's, in fact, the practices are in many ways, well, as we know too well today, a lot of the ways of, separating separating oneself from a person with skin disease, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it holds up even in modern cultures to such a large extent.
Well, separating someone who has COVID-19, for example, presently, like it was really fascinating to see you writing this at this moment in history, where we have that sort of thing really hitting the modern world quite harshly. I mean, on a universal level, right? So it's very interesting to see your connection with disease on that particular level. But I think on that note, when you go back to Leviticus, you make that comment that in the ancient Near East, it's not as divided as maybe scholars wanted it to be, or would make it in their scholarship between, for example, sin and disease when it came to impurity and pollution. Could you maybe talk to us, some about that particular thing? Because I think this is right in line with your methodology on embodiment, of how we could in the modern world understand impurity and disease and the likes, but then the embodiment that we have in the ancient Near East, how you really bring out maybe how they were understanding sin and disease in a similar fashion, for example, in Leviticus.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'll put it like this. I think embodiment, we need to kind of maybe address in its own right. It's actually like, a tricky concept, or maybe I should begin by trying to address that before I bring in the issue of sin. So, I mean, basically I use the idea of it's a kind of fashionable term, but embodied cognition and embodiment as kind of my methodology or my theoretical framework for trying to explain impurity. And what I meant by that, and what I mean by that, is that basically, when we try to understand these ideas that sound so abstract, and we're so tempted coming from our modern culture to kind of to understand them as these kind of abstractions. I think that basically doesn't do justice, but it also makes it impossible to really understand where this is coming from and how to make sense of it. And what do I mean by that? Like, basically the idea is that, basically it's an evolutionary approach to thought, you might say. Mm-hmm. Basically it's saying that the ability to think abstractly comes from a very, basic, day-to-day existence. In other words, human language and human thought, in its most basic form, is an extension of animal thought. So basically, it means like you need to fulfill the needs as a creature, and you couldn't have terms for like these very like, what do we mean by abstract? Abstract means basically something that's not directly experienced. So how can you talk about something you don't directly experience? So, it's almost impossible to even think that you could invent a word. How would you invent a word for something that you don't experience? How could two human beings start talking about something that they can't experience? It's like, it's an impossibility, really. So you need to have something that you can talk about that's embodied, something that's real, something that you can point at. Before that, you can build, that's like the building blocks for being able to talk about things that are more, experientially distant or remote. So that's basically, very much in a nutshell, like this idea that basically, in order to be able to talk about something abstract, you need to have, first of all, something very concrete and very experientially close, which is the body or the senses and whatever. So that's basically the try. And basically what I overall am trying to claim in the book is basically you have this very physiological concept of impurity, and that ultimately, even within the Bible itself, becomes kind of the raw materials for discussing things that are actually a bit more like social, which would be, the case of morality. That's the idea. Like, and basically that would tie into the difference between the priestly source and the holiness code, which maybe we can talk about a bit later. But basically the idea is that when we talk about like ontological, real pollution, that's the kind of pollution that was dangerous in the ancient Near East, that becomes ultimately a resource for talking about other kinds of pollution that weren't real pollution, but were like pollution. And maybe they're real, but just not real in the same way. So that's kind of the idea, that you kind of move from something very, concrete to something more and more abstract. Now, like, so that's kind of introduction. So get back to the idea of the relationship between sin and disease. Now, in basically, the way of thinking in the ancient Near East and in ancient Israel, it depends on where you're reading in the Bible, but basically it's clear that the kind of the default, and what happens is, for example, the book of Job is kind of arguing with this default, but it's obviously there, is this idea that if you're suffering, it means that you're being punished for some sin. They had, in the ancient Near East, they had other ways of understanding disease, like demons attacking you and all kinds of other things. But among all the other reasons that you might be sick, you should think about what you've done. And for example, we have the shurpu incantations, which are basically a confession of maybe you disrespected your parents, maybe you disrespected the gods, you could have done all these. It's basically the assumption is that you're sick, you've done something wrong, and you see this also in the Bible. But what's interesting is that in the priestly source in Leviticus, there's nothing said about that. If anything, there might be the slightest thing that we could argue, maybe a half a line here or there, but basically I would make the argument that there's no connection made between being sick and there's two things. Basically, being sick, as far as Leviticus is concerned, is about being impure. And I'm talking specifically about like Leviticus, 13 and 14, which is the skin disease, sarat, which is translated often as leprosy, and also in chapter 15, which is the genital, what do you call them?
Gonorrhea and all that,
which I think you could fairly accurately translate as gonorrhea. So those are sources of impurity. There's no hint that those are caused by someone being sinful. But if you actually look back at, for example, David's curse of Avner in 2 Samuel 3:29, he curses him. He didn't curse Avner. He curses Joab for killing Avner. Sorry, I'm mixing up, blaming the victim. So David's cursing Joab, and he among the other, all the horrible things that he wishes upon him, he wishes that he will be a gonorrheic or a leper, which are exactly the categories we have in Leviticus. So we see there that it is a divine punishment for a sin. So, but in Leviticus, you don't hear about that. So so basically, when you put the Mesopotamian evidence next to Leviticus, there's a few differences between how they're treating disease. So in Leviticus, basically, it's a source of impurity, and there's no connection with sin. Whereas in Mesopotamia and other places, we see that it's very closely associated with sin. At least as a possibility. And the other aspect that's, I think, very key that I write about is the fact that in the Mesopotamian rituals, basically you also have healing rituals, which are conspicuously absent in Leviticus. Basically, the rituals are very similar in Leviticus, but they don't claim to heal the person. They just claim to purify the person and allow them to participate in the cult and whatever, or in the community.
So then I suppose on one level, then what's happening in P is they're just trying to keep the camp clean, right? Trying to keep impurity out in one sense, but not asking the deeper question, why is this happening? But here's what we must do about it in order to keep it clean, correct?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's kind of downgraded the whole idea of impurity because basically, I mean, this. Okay, let's take the case of the Metzorah, the leper. So in Leviticus 13 and 14. So they say you have to put him outside the camp and he has to be disheveled and he has to wear a face mask even. He has to cover up his lip. People get angry with me basically. That's like so why is this guy out there out of the camp and everyone has to stay away from him, and actually if we look at 2 Kings 7, we actually see that these people are outside the camp and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the sanctuary. But in Leviticus, it seems very clear that the whole point is that you want him outside of the camp where God dwells, and whole thing about like basically when you ultimately purify him, according to Leviticus 14, you're basically establishing this connection between him and the sanctuary. They sprinkle the oil in the direction of the sanctuary, the place of the divine presence, and they sprinkle it and then they put it on him. And basically the idea is reconciling him with this, the community that's dwelling in the divine presence, which is, so what I'm trying to say is like this. Basically, in the ancient Near East, and I assume in ancient Israel also, basically there was dangerous impurity. There's a kind which was basically disease, among other things. It was it was infectious disease. They talked about it in the terms of impurity. And by the way, it's not only in the ancient Near East. After I started writing about this, I discovered that a medical anthropologist named Edward Green had written a book called Indigenous Theories of Infectious Disease. And basically the central theory of infectious disease that he found in southwestern Africa was basically impurity. So basically the idea of talking about infection in the language of impurity is something that basically exists. So we have dangerous impurity, and then we also have basically what I would call uncleanness. And uncleanness is basically a state where you're not allowed to approach gods. And basically a different level. Basically, to be unclean is not as bad as being, in a threatening state of impurity. Throughout, the ancient Near East, and I would assume that it's basically universal. You don't approach a god when you're unclean or even untidy. Basically you're approaching, the god. You want to be well dressed. You want to check your breath. You're talking to the god. So what happens in Leviticus? It's kind of like you're taking this type of impurity was assumed to be dangerous. You would, basically you're banishing this guy from the camp, but they're basically downgrading it and making it basically saying, no, the real reason you're putting it out of the camp is really because of, the divine presence. It's not because he's posing a threat to the people. Basically it's not a danger to other people. And that's kind of like, that's where you see that there's some kind of tension, I think, between what what common sense would say when you're reading the text and what the text explicitly says, which is that everything is just about the holy camp. So, for me, that was a very important example that, basically there's something going on here, and there's also a polemic. Basically a big part of my discussion of impurity and disease is saying that P is really kind of is maybe not a polemic. I mean, it is some sort of a polemic, but basically it's trying to neutralize what are popular beliefs regarding impurity. So, which is, basically you're trying to read between the lines of the text.
I found that fascinating that comparing the Mesopotamian ritual healing rites, saying that P is really pushing back against this in order to bring impurity, I guess, down a level, like what you're saying. I found that to be quite fascinating in your work. I wonder if this isn't a good point, Mati, where we could maybe for our audience. And when you say P, you mean the priestly code, right? Leviticus 1-16 as a source. But then we also talk about H, beginning with Leviticus 17, which we refer to as the Holiness code. So maybe you could now describe for our audience the difference between, say, what we have with regard to impurity here in P up until chapter 16, and then what happens later in the Holiness code, what is happening with impurity there and moral metaphor as you describe in your book.
So yeah, sure. So here's the thing. So first of all, at this time, and this is something that's relatively not controversial, which is good for biblical, biblical studies. Almost everything is disputed. It seems like today, most people have kind of formed a consensus, especially following the work of Israel Knoll, regarding, I mean, not about everything he wrote, of course, but but basically the idea, and he wasn't the first to say this, but that H, especially as far as the book of Leviticus is concerned, is basically the holiness layer, we might say, is basically the final editing, we could call it, of Leviticus, and it's basically absorbing the earlier parts of Leviticus and basically what we might say the earlier priestly traditions about the tabernacle. And basically the thing is this: so we have P, which is chapters 1 through 16. And we have, H, which is chapters 17 through 26 or 27, however you want to delineate it. But the thing is this, P is very focused on the sacrificial system, the sanctuary, and everything like that. And impurity functions within that, as we were just discussing, basically about being pure when you're in the place of the divine presence. Now, what's very fascinating in the book of Leviticus itself is that chapter 17, which is basically actually the hinge, or the between P and H, basically focuses on the idea of cult centralization, which is basically that everything having to do with the cult needs, basically every sacrifice that you want to bring, you have to bring to the tent of meeting. You have to bring it to the centralized sanctuary. Now, when we read this today, it's generally understood that this is in some ways an analogy for the land of Israel. So meaning that basically the central sanctuary, and some people would argue with this, but the idea would be that basically we're talking about a single sanctuary, and that was the central sanctuary for all of Israel, and that was the place where you had to bring all your sacrifices. Like the book of Deuteronomy says, basically in this level, basically Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12, and especially Deuteronomy 12, basically are on the same page for the most part. There might be a little bit of a disagreement, but in general, they're about on the same page, that basically all cultic activity is in this one single place, which we now interpret as being Jerusalem. But maybe Deuteronomy was talking about something else in Greece or whatever, but whatever. But in any case, it's a centralized sanctuary. So this is the point. So basically, okay, so P is talking about bringing all your sacrifices and all the rules of sacrifice. And now we know from Leviticus 17 that this is all in one place. So what about all the rest of Israel? They just sit there twiddling their thumbs. Like, well, what about religiosity? Because, at some, before the cult was centralized, the assumption would be that people were bringing sacrifices in local sanctuaries, wherever they may be. You need, whatever, you could bring your Thanksgiving offerings, your expiatory offerings. You could do that, close to home. You didn't need to go on a pilgrimage every time you want to bring a sacrifice. And one of my proofs is the idea of the woman who gives birth. The idea of a woman giving birth, having to schlep her baby with her to, Jerusalem after 40 days. To me, it all makes much more sense if you're talking about a situation when you had a localized sanctuary.
Yeah.
But anyways, Leviticus 17, which is actually H, it kind of goes along with it with Deuteronomy and saying, no, there's one sanctuary and everything has to be done there. So what about the rest of what about the rest of Israel? So Deuteronomy worries about whether, where you're going to eat your meat, because you have to eat your meat, if you only can, sorry, I'm going off the topic, but basically the idea of, sacrifice, part of sacrifice was eating meat. So Deuteronomy says, wait a minute, if you can't eat meat unless you're bringing a sacrifice, and you have to go all the way to the centralized sanctuary to eat, that's too much. So people can eat their secular meat. So then you have this idea of, secular meat, basar hulin, that you can eat anywhere else in Israel. In any case, that's Deuteronomy. The Holiness Code is worried about something else. How do people have religious lives, outside of Jerusalem or the centralized sanctuary? And that's where I think that the emphasis in H on the holiness of the land and the idea of, and that basically connects with the idea. So basically H focuses on this idea of the holiness of the land.
Yeah.
And that includes this idea of moral impurity. And the moral impurity basically something that defiles the land, according to Leviticus 18 and 20. So basically what H is doing, and here I think is the key, basically H is basically taking up these central concepts of P and translating them into basically kind of a framework that appeals not only to priests operating in a sanctuary, but to basically the whole nation.
Yeah.
And among that whole basically kind of extension of the whole like conceptual world of P, H does that to impurity. And that means pulling the idea of impurity into something that's even more general, and which is basically, moral, what we would call moral impurity.
Fascinating. I think that's really good for our listeners. It really, I think, brings it down to a level of, yes, you could make sense if we're dealing with something in such close proximity as the camp, and impurity on the level of infectious disease, like you say it, to go broader than that, to go something moral, right? Something with behavior in that particular sense. So I find that quite fascinating, and that it would have implications for holiness and the land, et cetera, and so forth. So I think that's very helpful. Mati, do you want to ask one of our next questions?
Yeah. I think I might just kind of continue with this train of thought that you were going on with.
Yeah.
Which, as you talk about, then what would be the role of temple and sacrifice within this framework that you've kind of presented? You talked about maybe what it would look like throughout the whole land of Israel. And with this framework in mind, what would be the role of this sacrificial system? We can kind of expound on that.
So here's the thing, and correct me if I'm missing the gist of the question. Basically, first of all, one of the important things in recognizing that basically H is kind of a redaction or is encompassing P, it's actually geographically encompassing P, as we're talking about. Basically, it's taking P as the sanctuary and H is the land. I mean, it's simplistic, but it's true, because H also worries about things like the sabbatical year and the land. Okay, I mean, H is good, but now what's important though is that H is almost, basically doesn't contradict P. Not only does it not contradict P, some people would argue there's a few points here and there, but I'm not sure there's even one place where H contradicts P, and which makes sense because H is basically absorbing P, and if it wanted, it could censor. But in any case, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know if there were parts of P that H didn't like. But in any case, as far as we see, that they're harmoniously together. And more than that, H respects basically the hierarchy implied by P, in the sense that basically the supreme holiness is that of the place of the divine presence, of the priesthood, priests, or the high priest especially, who's serving in the in the Holy of Holies and inside the sanctuary. So there's no kind of competition, in the sense that basically H is expanding the scope of holiness, but it's not at the price of diminishing the supreme holiness of the sanctuary and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's it's important to see that basically that hierarchy remains in H, and H comes back. H talks about the high priest and things like that. It's not like H has no interest in the sanctuary; it's there too. There's rules about the priesthood in Leviticus 21, and the sanctuary in Leviticus 22. So that the sanctuary is still a part of H. it extends holiness, but it doesn't necessarily, but it doesn't in any way challenge the holiness of the sanctuary. And what's interesting is basically, in speaking about holiness, actually, is that H's scheme of holiness is slightly or radically different than P's holiness. Because as I talk about in my chapter on contagious holiness, right. So P's holiness is again an ontological type of holiness, just like impurity is an ontological. It's a thing. It's a real force. It's a force, like for P. So too, holiness is a force in P that you could actually it can be transmitted to objects. Apparently not people. In Ezekiel, he actually can potentially even be contagious to people. In H, holiness is something different. In H, again, the emphasis is on fulfilling commandments. It's on behaviors that can be carried out by the populace, the Israelites far away from the sanctuary. Perhaps people would say they're even in exile, but H is pretty concerned with the land, so that's not necessary. In any case, it's not cultic. The holiness is an imitation of God, and here we have to be a little bit careful. What does it mean to be like God by fulfilling commandments? But the idea, I would say in a nutshell, is just like God is different from the other gods, which don't exist. It would be, assumed according to H. Israel is expected to be different from all the other nations. And how are they different from everyone else? Well, by fulfilling God's commandments. And that's their way of being holiness. That's the way of being holy, sorry. Yeah.
On that note, I was going to ask this question similar to yours, Mati, then. So, if I think of, for example, the work of Jacob Milgram in the Anchor Bible Commentary on Leviticus, talking about the conceptual framework where he goes, it seems to be that the symbol of impurity, or at least what comes from an impurity, is something like death, for example. And it is death that is attacking the sancta ultimately. And it is through Israel's sacrificial system that the blood of animals, which has the life in it, right? It has the life force, I guess, is cleansing the holy things and the holy sancta and the like, protecting holiness within the camp, cleansing the impurities from it. I know that you're challenging in one sense the symbolism of where Milgram takes it, but maybe you can describe in light of your own research, how then does the sacrificial system function then with regard to blood and the cleansing of the impurities? How do you see that functioning?
Wow, this is a challenge. You're actually asking me in some ways to tie together my two books.
Yes, right, with your blood expiation. Yeah.
That's pushing me a bit.
So here comes the third book then, yeah?
Yeah. I'm going to have to dig deep into to draw this connection out. So here's the thing. First of all, part of the thing is, like, first of all, with a ton of respect for Milgram's work, I probably,
of course,
I could say with certainty that I would never be dealing with any of this stuff if I hadn't read Milgram at an early stage in my scholarship, because who would want to talk about impurity? I mean that's what Mary Douglas did to the whole topic in the first place, and that's Milgram did that for the whole, basically the cultic system, you might say, in general. He basically showed how this was actually quite interesting and has all kinds of meanings. Much beyond just killing animals. So right. So now how does this all work? So I mean, the truth is there's a lot, and first of all, but the thing is this: when I have a lot of issues with the symbolic line of interpretation. First of all, for the reasons I said from earlier, because I just don't think that's it's not. I think it's an anachronistic way of thinking. It's tempting for us to kind of make this kind of to use these abstract terms, but I don't think First of all, I'll put it like this. First of all, I don't think that's how it really the the patterns of thought developed. I think that you have to start much more concretely. And
Embodiment, right? That's your embodiment
yeah.
thesis there. Yeah. So
first of all, you have to understand where is impurity coming from before I just start saying it symbolizes death. Like basically, I've kind of turned it now into something like, a broad category. But first of all, I mean, a large part of my book is arguing that basically impurity is not one thing. Impurity is disease. Impurity is unclean animals. And impurity relates to the soul leaving the body in the case of corpse impurity. Now that's the case of me. But in each case, you have to understand the logic in its own before you can start kind of throwing everything together. I think you first want to learn like the details of why each type of impurity acts the way it does, and what's the folk beliefs, to use a term, that goes along with that, and then before you kind of just say it's all like one system.
Yeah.
I put it like this. I wouldn't disagree that the priestly source has a system, but it's a system that I would say it's not a system that was basically top down, meaning that everything was like kind of made from one. Basically, it's not a product of a design that was designed from that a designer. I mean, this it's kind of sacrilegious, but basically, it's not something that was created, how do you say, ex nihilo, that God basically, produced this blueprint kind of from the, he created it, just like he just planted it that way. And according to the system of life and death and things like that. I think it's actually it's a system, but it's a messy system. It's a system that basically has all kinds of folk beliefs that developed in Israel, and that P is trying to mold them into something that basically fits its basically broader, theological worldview, meaning that, these certain things, it's more of a theology of deleting things that are bad beliefs, like certain types of rituals to get rid of demons and things like that. Those are things you move out because it doesn't fit there. But it's not something that basically there's things that don't fit in. Like I was talking about the leper that you banished from this. There's things that like you see the raw materials that it was working with. It wasn't something that like everything fits this idea of holiness. Peace system. It's putting together all kinds of pieces that were already kind of part of a popular religion in ancient Israel.
Yeah, so I guess in one sense you're saying it's doing away with the competing rituals with regard to impurity and disease and the like, but at the same time it's centralizing. I mean, it happens in H, like what you're saying, but it's certainly centralizing the sacrificial cult. But there's great variety within that, even, correct? So you have differences of sacrifices and the expiation rites. But would you agree then that what's happening in the sacrificial system is sort of where Milgram goes with it, a full-on cleansing of impurity with the different sacrifices? Would you agree with that in light of your work?
Yeah, so let's see. First of all, I mean, I don't understand. I understand the dynamic with blood a bit differently than him. And I actually think it's more of in my first book, basically, I argue that the language of kippur, of atonement, is actually literally expiation, and the idea that expia in Latin is basically to pay off. And the idea is that basically it comes from the idea of blood guilt. And this is kind of a long argument, but basically the bottom line is that when in the context of blood guilt is when someone spills somebody's blood, the payback has to go back on the murderer, right? The person by the one who spills blood. The one who spills blood by Genesis 9, right? So we have
the one who sheds blood.
One who spills blood. By man,
his blood shall be spilled.
By his blood shall be spilled. Yeah. Right. So the idea is that basically there's a eye for an eye, but it's literally a blood for a blood payment. It's a whole blood becomes this commerce of basically this is part of the blood feud, whatever. Any case, so my argument is that this is the idea that blood becomes this kind of way of paying off guilt. Any case, so, and that's what kippur means in its kind of basic form.
Yeah.
And now, and so let's see. So this is the thing. So you have different types of sin offerings. I call them sin offerings. So okay, sin offering, they say that you that a person would bring
instead of purification offering, right?
Right. So Milgram calls it purification offerings, which is a whole argument in itself. It's but it's the word chatat, it comes from, it's very simply is from the word for sin.
Yeah.
And people would bring sin offerings when they would bring them to the sanctuary when they had a reason to, when they had guilt. Now, I would actually argue, and this is again reading between the lines of P, that people would usually bring their sin offerings when they were suffering in some way, because it's just like in the like I was saying before, the Mesopotamians, when people were sick, they start, looking into what they did wrong. I mean, this is actually, I mean, we a lot of us do this even today, is when you why is God doing this to me? And I think a primary reason why someone would bring a sin offering would be, especially a sin offering for an unknown sin, right? Leviticus 4 talks about bringing a sin offering for an unknown sin. What is an unknown sin? Like, why would you bring one? Right? And so apparently it's because someone was sick and they had a reason to bring it. Now, again, it seems like P is trying to kind of wipe something under, sweep something under the rug here. But in any case, but I think that would be a major. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of this it's not really sanctuary cleaning for the most part. People are actually trying to clean themselves, I think. But the Yom Kippur ritual, Leviticus 16, for sure, is a attempt to purify the sanctuary of everything, like of all the residues but specifically the residues of people's, voluntary, brazen sins and things like that. So there you really do have this idea of purging the sanctuary. Is it this big scheme of life versus death? I don't really think that's what's going on, but and again, and even there, and this is an important thing, that it's actually only there in that chapter that you see a kind of a merging of the terminology of sin and of basically sin and impurity. Usually P is very careful to say someone's bringing a sacrifice for sin, and then it says that it says that the priest basically atones for him and he's forgiven for a sin. But in the case of impurities, it says v'chiper alav v'taher mitumato. Like he brings the priest atones for him and he's purified. And that is, so basically there's a strict distinction in P between sin and impurity in general. But in Leviticus 16, actually there you see that there's a little bit of a blurring of everything together. So there, you could make the argument that, we really are purifying the sanctuary of sin and impurities and everything there. So there you could make that case. I think it's a reasonable case, but it's important to realize that it's really there and only there that P does that kind of merging of the two categories.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, good.
So I kind of have a question.
Part of this kind of idea of this, comprehensive ritual to just do, basically clean everything, get rid of everything.
Yeah.
So I have a question.
By the way, I claim. Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, part of my argument is actually this is also part of P's attempt to take control of all these cultic activities in the same way that he's trying to get rid of all these like individual exorcistic rites to get rid of demons and healing rituals and all these things like that. He's like, no, we're going to take all this stuff and we're going to break into one day. Basically, we're going to make it to this like one day, do everything ritual. I mean, there's still these, individual sin offerings, but there's definitely this idea of consolidating like, the all ritual activity into like this thing that's under strict supervision. I don't know, it's
So the question I have, the way I'm going to ask this question is I'm actually going to use a quote from your preface that I really enjoyed. It was very interesting to me. You say that our ability to understand these ancient texts and any linguistic expression for that matter is defined by our ability to relate its content to our own personal experience. Now, I realize that sentence is loaded. I didn't realize how loaded it was until I got into your research, realizing that maybe your main point in saying this line was to connect to the idea that, first off, if we see any sort of cultural component within one culture that's expressed in cultures around the world, we have some explaining to do, right? Like we can't just look at a culture in isolation. Also, this quote could be in getting back into embodiment idea that you're talking about. But I'm kind of going to ask a question that's a little more practical. Maybe you've done this really deep research. You've really looked into these things. And in a way, I found a lot, sometimes academic research requires a suspension of how does this matter right now, right? We just follow our interests. We follow research and data, and we just see what's going on. And so this might be a tough question to ask you, but I wonder what's kind of a practical at the other end of your research that you see of how this might impact people beyond necessarily just looking at of ancient people of the past. So whether we're talking about people across the world in general, or maybe people of faith, people who see something divine in the Torah, any practical type of walkaway points that you see in this?
So, wow, that's an interesting question. So here's one of the things. I mean, like I was saying previously, basically in modern discourse, there's an attempt to separate religion from science, and this kind of really connects to that sentence, because what I'm claiming is that actually there's not as much explaining to do when you actually understand what the Torah is doing with impurity, or at least where it's coming from and how impurity functions in these traditional cultures. Basically, among other things, as a discourse on disease, as a discourse on disgust, all kinds of things that are very close to us, things that we can relate to even as modern human beings. And it's not something, primitive that has no relevance to us today. It's things that are very, it's real. And the thing is like this. So basically, I wrote an article in the journal Cognitive Science on how impurity beliefs served as a theory for disease avoidance. And basically what we have is an evolutionary scheme where basically religion and science are basically religion. In this case, if we call impurity religious, then these religious beliefs were things that promoted, survival, well-being. They're not primitive, and they're actually, facilitate, health. So basically, I'm not sure exactly where this leads, taking this, forward, but basically the idea is that instead of looking at religion as something irrational and detached from experience, basically my argument is that religion has always been kind of rooted and grounded in experience. And, basically it was always part of experience. And I mean, I think that should still be part of the discourse today, instead of trying to separate them in a way that's kind of to be diplomatic and to save religion from being like unscientific and losing all its, credibility and things like that. I think it's to try to understand, there's something very real in these religious ideas, and maybe we talk about them in a different way today. Maybe we wouldn't call it impurity today, but but it was real, and basically they're talking about the same reality we're talking about, today.
Yeah, they're talking about it from a place of embodiment, like you were saying, I think. And you sort of mentioned naturalism a little bit towards the end, don't you? I think I had a definition that you had, but it sort of made me think of that the ancients were, in fact, observing the natural order. We wouldn't maybe call it scientific, but they were doing something like what we call the scientific method in a worldview of naturalism, that there was something like that going on. Is that sort of where you're going with that and what you're saying about that?
So yeah, I mean, naturalism actually has a lot of like uses. Sometimes people are trying to find the reasons, behind religion and things like that. But basically, going with what you're saying is that, yeah, I claim that P has a sort of pseudo-naturalism, that it kind of almost by accident. I mean, maybe, as far as I can see, it looks like it's almost accidental by the way that it's trying to, I think its main agenda is religious in terms of trying to avoid these healing rituals that it found, basically antithetical to proper belief. But at the same time, what happens is like this: like if you decide that impurity is not let's put it like this: if you say that sickness is not caused by sin, well, then what causes it? Well, if you think that, you're basically, if you're moving it, you're saying it's physiological then in some level. You're basically saying the physiological domain is separate from this like moral domain or this domain of divine intervention. And if you say that the body kind of operates according to its own rules, and I mean, by the way, I mean, that's almost, should be self-understood. I mean, any traditional culture and any ancient culture, they understand nature. They don't expect like the world to, I don't know. Actually, you watch these Marvel movies, like the whole world is like blowing up and things are shooting out. I mean, that's like unnatural, but like, that's not the world that people ever lived in.
Right.
People understood the law. Understood the law of gravity without, having a word for that. They just understood that things stick to the ground. Right. I mean, it's like, so, I mean, where was I going with this? So yeah. So basically, I mean, the idea that the world operates according to like, fixed laws, I mean, that's always been there. The only thing you need to do is to kind of put a little bit of boundaries where you let divine intervention kind of, break those laws. Yeah. And what I'm saying, what I try to argue is that you can see some signs that P is purposely trying to put those boundaries in to try to, maybe by accident, but in any case, what it does is kind of creates this domain of nature, or it strengthens this idea of that there's this natural world and that impurity is part of that natural world, because it's part of bodily occurrences that are not, punishments or anything else. They're just things that happen to your body. So, I mean, there's actually a lot of interesting things that happen the moment you have that, because that actually opens the door for H to take impurity in and start saying, well, actually, there's a different type of impurity that's sin, and that has nothing to do with being sick and all this other stuff. But
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Leviticus 17 is sort of the logical extension of P. That's where you're going to end up then, right? So right there at the tabernacle. Okay, well, we've probably taken enough of Yitzhaq's time, I suppose, at this point. Don't you think, Mati? It's getting late in Israel. So
yeah, we want to make sure to respect your time. Are there any last thoughts that you would want just listeners to be able to know about your work and the ideas that you've come through your research? There doesn't have to be, we've discussed a lot. I just want to open that up in case there's something that you were dying to get to say, something that you'd want to also add.
No, I just, it's an honor to be, first of all, it's an honor to be read by readers, close readers like yourselves. And I could only, hope that, other readers will be engaged and find, what I've written to be stimulating. and that we will be able to draw these connections between different disciplines, and we won't feel threatened by people from different disciplines kind of sharing their criticisms, as well as insights, because a lot of interdisciplinary work is kind of like, yeah, you borrow something from a different discipline, but you're not allowed to kind of criticize the other discipline based on what you see. And I think that what I find in my interdisciplinary work, and I don't think it's arrogance, it's just that you coming from a different perspective, is that you just see things that people that are so deep in their their what do you call it, their their academic world, I forget what you call it, but
their discipline.
A guild, the word I was looking for, guild. Yeah. You're so in your own guild, they don't actually see the weaknesses and the assumptions that are kind of each person is kind of just kind of reinforcing. Everyone's validating these kind of assumptions, and no one's questioning those assumptions. And suddenly, when you come from a totally different direction, you say, "Wait a minute, like, why do you think that way?" So, yeah, I just hope that will take place, that kind of conversation, and yeah, I hope to learn from everyone else too. Yeah,
excellent.
Well, that's excellent. It's again, another reason we've loved having you on is both just the specific research topic itself that's fascinating, but also just the methodology which you provide, which you go through this, that you beautifully summarized in your own words, right? You're bringing in a lot of different disciplines, and you're right. I think it definitely, hopefully, can be a challenge, and maybe hopefully an inspiring invitation to people to say, stretch beyond what you thought you had to stick to, and it might help bring a more holistic perspective, bring others in the conversation. So speaking of that, thank you for joining our conversation with our listeners. I'm sure they're going to be very glad to get to learn about you, connect more with you. And we'll put links to your materials where people can find your book, as well as, I believe you're on Academia, right? .edu, I believe I saw, right? I think I checked out that. So we'll put a link to that as well. Anyone who wants to find you, more of what you do. Natan, you have any last words?
No, well, thoughts? But no, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your research, and I'll look forward to that book regarding where you blend your two, right? The expiation book and this one. So,
yeah. Well, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your penetrating questions and helping me think about other new things that I hadn't thought about before. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we enjoyed it. Thanks for coming.